Ambassador Zorp Glorbax adjusted his ceremonial collar for the 14th time that morning. The silken material felt unusually constricting today, though he knew the true source of his discomfort lay elsewhere. He glanced at the holographic display floating above his desk, its soft blue glow illuminating the meticulously arranged office. "The humans have responded to our invitation," announced Xyler, his young assistant, practically vibrating with excitement as she burst through the door. Zorp suppressed a sigh. Xyler's enthusiasm for the emerging civilizations on the galactic fringe was admirable but exhausting. In his 237 years as a diplomat for the Galactic Concordat, he had seen many species come and go. Some integrated seamlessly into the ancient political structure that had maintained peace among the stars for millennia. Others, well, there was a reason certain solar systems remained under prolonged observation. And, he inquired, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence, a sign of mild irritation that Xyler either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "They've accepted," Xyler exclaimed, her skin flashing a bright yellow with excitement. "But there's something else." Zorp felt his primary stomach tighten. There was always something else with these frontier species. "Continue. They've included what they call non-negotiable basic cultural and biological requirements." Xyler's voice dropped to a whisper as if she were sharing classified information. In a sense, she was requirements. Zorp's scales stiffened along his spine. They're being invited to join the most prestigious and powerful alliance in the known universe, with access to technologies they can scarcely comprehend, and they have requirements. 5 of them, to be exact. Xyler activated her personal data pad and began reading. First, their delegation must be permitted to bring a contingent of 5 therapy corgis with full diplomatic privileges. "What is a corgi?" Zorp pronounced the unfamiliar word carefully. Xyler quickly projected an image. Zorp stared at the small, 4-legged creature with disproportionately short limbs and an inexplicably happy expression. "It's a subcategory of their companion species, known as dogs," Xyler explained. "Specifically bred for companionship and emotional support. They wish to bring emotional support animals to a diplomatic summit." Zorp's voice rose an octave. "This is unprecedented." "There's more," Xyler continued, her enthusiasm undiminished. "Second, they request a mobile cat cafe area at the conference, open to all delegates." Another image appeared, sleek, aloof creatures lounging on various surfaces while sentient beings consumed beverages nearby. Third, they wish to host a galactic chili cook-off as an official team-building activity. "I don't even know what that means," Zorp muttered. Fourth, they demand guaranteed rights to use memes and GIFs in official presentations. Zorp's translator implant struggled with these terms, eventually settling on culturally significant repetitive visual communication tools. "And finally," Xyler concluded, "they request unlimited supplies of bubble tea in various flavors for the Earth delegation." Silence fell over the office as Zorp processed this information. The Concordat had expected the humans to be grateful, perhaps even intimidated by the invitation. Instead, they were making demands that bordered on the absurd. "Have you consulted the archives for precedent?" Zorp finally asked. "Yes, Ambassador. There is none." Xyler's skin had shifted to a more neutral blue. "However, I have studied human culture extensively, and these requests, while unusual, align with their social and psychological patterns. They place great importance on informality and what they call breaking the ice in new relationships." Zorp's upper eyes narrowed, while his lower ones reviewed the formal invitation they had sent. The humans had successfully developed faster-than-light travel only 5 years ago, remarkably quick progress for such a young species. Their expansion into neighboring systems had been equally rapid and somewhat concerning to the Concordat Security Council. "The High Council is quite interested in bringing humans into the fold," Xyler reminded him gently. "They represent a unique, innovative potential." Zorp understood the subtext. Humans were unpredictable and potentially destabilizing. Better to have them inside the diplomatic framework than operating independently. Still, these conditions prepare a response. he said finally. Inform them that their requirements will be accommodated. As Xyler turned to leave, he added, and initiate a comprehensive briefing on these corgis. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with. After she left, Zorp sank into his meditation posture. He had a foreboding sense that the upcoming Peace and Integration Summit would be unlike any in the Concordat's 10,000-year history. The grand arrival hall of Alpha Central Station had been meticulously prepared for the human delegation's arrival. Banners representing the Concordat's 87 founding species hung from the vaulted ceiling. The air was perfumed with the universally pleasing scent of Centaurian lotus, and the lighting had been adjusted to Earth standard specifications. Zorp had briefed the welcoming committee extensively. Humans are emotionally expressive and physically demonstrative, he had explained, trying to conceal his discomfort. They may attempt to touch you as a greeting. This is not intended as an insult or threat. They also engage in something called small talk before addressing substantial matters. Consider this a cultural peculiarity rather than a deliberate waste of time. Despite the preparation, nothing could have fully readied the assembled dignitaries for the actual arrival of the Earth delegation. Ambassador Lin Wei stepped through the docking bay doors first, a woman of striking presence with intelligent eyes and a warm but determined expression. She wore a tailored suit in deep blue that somehow managed to look both formal and approachable. Behind her came 4 other humans of varying appearances, and then, by the sacred nebulae, whispered an Andorian diplomat as 5 small, orange and white creatures trotted into the hall, each wearing miniature vests emblazoned with Earth's planetary symbol. The corgis had arrived. Zorp stepped forward and began the traditional 17-part greeting of the Concordat. He had reached only the 4th section when Ambassador Lin interrupted him with a warm smile. Ambassador Glorbax, what an absolute pleasure to meet you in person. She extended her hand. On behalf of Earth, we are honored by your invitation and thrilled to begin this historic partnership. Zorp stared at the extended hand, mentally reviewing protocol for this situation. Reluctantly, he extended his own scaled appendage. The human grasped it firmly and moved it up and down several times, the gesture they called a handshake. The honor is ours, he replied stiffly. We have prepared accommodations according to your specifications. Before he could continue with the formal proceedings, one of the corgis approached a reptilian warrior chief known for his ferocity in the border conflicts. The small creature sat before the imposing figure and lifted a paw. To Zorp's astonishment, Chief Thrax, destroyer of the Vargan fleet, knelt down and tentatively touched the extended paw. What is this gesture? The warrior asked, his gravelly voice unusually soft. That's Winston offering to shake hands, explained a human aide with a smile. He's very friendly. A warrior's greeting, Thrax declared, seeming pleased. Your battle beast shows respect. Xyler, standing beside Zorp, was frantically taking notes on her datapad. Fascinating, she murmured. Immediate cross-species bonding through companion animals. The psychological implications are enormous. Zorp felt his orderly welcome ceremony dissolving into chaos as the humans began introducing themselves to various delegates. The corgis wandered freely among the assembled dignitaries, and Ambassador Lin suggested they grab some refreshments and chat informally before the official proceedings. Ambassador, Xyler whispered urgently, the humans have already begun setting up their cat cafe and bubble tea station in the East Wing. Several delegates are expressing curiosity. Zorp's scales flushed a pale green, a sign of extreme stress among his species. Maintain protocol where possible, he instructed, and remind all staff that the corgis have diplomatic immunity. The first formal session was scheduled for that afternoon. Zorp spent the intervening hours in his private chamber, reviewing his presentation and attempting to center himself. When he entered the Grand Council chamber, he was momentarily stunned into immobility. The ancient, hallowed room had been transformed. In one corner, a section had been cordoned off with comfortable seating where several Earth felines lounged regally on cushions. Delegates from various worlds sat nearby, sipping beverages and engaging in conversation. The traditional seating arrangement had been altered to form a more circular pattern rather than the hierarchical rows that had been used for millennia. And there, at the central podium, where Zorp himself was supposed to deliver the opening address, stood Ambassador Lin, preparing her presentation. When the chamber's chimes announced the session's commencement, she smiled brilliantly at the assembled delegates. Distinguished representatives of the Galactic Concordat, she began, Earth is honored to join this historic alliance. The holographic display behind her illuminated with her first slide, not the expected diplomatic credentials, but an image of a small, disgruntled-looking feline, with text overlaid, First Interstellar Conference. Still waiting for the interesting part. A ripple of confused murmuring swept through the chamber, followed by something Zorp had rarely heard in these hallowed halls. Laughter. Not from all delegates, certainly, but enough to make him stiffen in shock. I see some of you are already familiar with our memes. Ambassador Lin continued smoothly. Excellent. Cultural exchange begins with shared humor. After all, from his seat, Zorp watched in horror as the human proceeded to give an engaging, informative, and thoroughly unorthodox presentation about Earth's history, cultural diversity, and technological development, liberally interspersed with what he now understood were memes and GIFs, including one of an Earth creature called a sloth, moving with excruciating slowness, which she used to illustrate her points about bureaucratic inefficiency. Beside him, Xyler was practically vibrating with excitement. Brilliant rhetorical technique, she whispered. The humor disarms potential criticism, while the self-deprecation presents them as non-threatening. It's completely inappropriate, Zorp hissed back. His dismay only increased when, during a scheduled break, one of the corgis, he believed it was the one called Winston, trotted up to his seat and placed its head on his knee, looking up with what he reluctantly recognized as affection. He likes you, said Ambassador Lin, approaching with 2 cups of bubble tea. She offered one to Zorp. Taro flavor. Xyler mentioned your species has a preference for root vegetables. Zorp accepted the drink automatically, too flustered to refuse. His hand moved of its own accord to the corgi's head, where his long fingers found themselves stroking the surprisingly soft fur. Winston has excellent judgment of character, Lin continued. He's been specially trained as a diplomatic therapy animal. Reduces stress, promotes honest communication. Fascinating, Zorp replied, withdrawing his hand when he realized what he was doing. However, I must remind you that the Concordat has established protocols for— Of course, Lin interrupted gently, and we respect those protocols. We're just adding a few new elements that might enhance the process. After all, peace isn't just about rules and procedures, it's about connection. As she walked away, Zorp found himself staring at the strange drink in his hand. He cautiously sipped the bubble tea, startled when the chewy spheres at the bottom traveled up the oversized straw. The flavor was not unpleasant. Winston wagged his tail once, then trotted after Ambassador Lin, leaving Zorp with the unsettling feeling that something fundamental was shifting beneath his feet. By the 3rd day of the conference, Zorp had developed a routine. Each morning, he would review the scheduled proceedings, adjust his expectations downward, and prepare himself for whatever chaos the humans might introduce. Each evening, he would retreat to his quarters and file increasingly bewildered reports to the High Council. The Cat Cafe had become an unofficial hub of diplomatic activity. Zorp couldn't explain it, but there was something about the presence of the serene felines that seemed to lower defensive postures and encourage candor. Minor agreements that had been stalled for decades were suddenly being resolved over cups of cappuccino, another Earth beverage that had become surprisingly popular. The corgis, meanwhile, had become unofficial ambassadors in their own right. They seemed to have an uncanny ability to identify delegates who were feeling isolated or stressed, offering their companionship without demanding anything in return. Even Chief Thrax had been observed sharing his meal rations with Winston, and rumors circulated that he had commissioned a miniature battle harness for the corgi. But it was the galactic chili cook-off that truly transformed the conference atmosphere. When Ambassador Lin had first explained the concept, a competitive cooking event where delegates would create their own versions of a spiced Earth dish, Zorp had flat-out refused to participate. Such frivolity had no place in serious diplomatic proceedings. Yet somehow, by midweek, nearly 30 delegations had entered the competition. The Grand Observation Deck had been converted into a massive kitchen space. Cooking stations were arranged by planetary system, with ingredients from across the galaxy available for experimentation. The air was filled with a cacophony of scents, some appetizing, others distinctly alarming. "You should reconsider your position, Ambassador," Xyler suggested as they observed the proceedings. "The High Council is quite interested in your participation." "Absolutely not," Zorp replied. "I'm a senior diplomat of the Concordat, not a culinary entertainer." "Of course," Xyler agreed smoothly, "though I can't help noticing that Secretary General of Clax himself has entered the competition. His team is preparing something with Rigelian fire peppers." Zorp's eyes widened. The Secretary General outranked him considerably. If he was participating in this human ritual, perhaps I could observe more closely, he conceded. Ambassador Lin spotted him hovering at the edge of the activity and immediately waved him over. "Ambassador Glorbax, perfect timing. We need an impartial judge for the spice level calibration." Before he could protest, Zorp found himself seated before a row of small sample dishes, each a different delegation's interpretation of chili. The experience was illuminating. Some were inedibly hot to his palate, others bizarrely sweet, and one, prepared by the methane-breathing Jovians, emitted a faint blue glow that he found concerning. To his surprise, Zorp found himself engaged in discussions about flavor compounds, cultural food taboos, and the curious human tradition of comfort food. When Xyler presented him with a specially formulated, xenobiologically safe version of traditional Earth chili, he surprised himself by accepting a full portion. "Not entirely unpleasant," he admitted, which Xyler correctly interpreted as high praise. Later that evening, as delegates mingled and compared their culinary creations, Zorp observed something remarkable. Species that had historical animosities were laughing together over failed cooking attempts. Cultural information was being exchanged freely. The rigid hierarchy that typically governed Concordat interactions had temporarily dissolved, replaced by a more egalitarian atmosphere. Xyler found him watching the proceedings with an uncharacteristically thoughtful expression. "I've been analyzing the human approach," she said, falling into step beside him. "Their requirements weren't arbitrary cultural peculiarities, as we initially assumed. They're sophisticated social engineering tools." "Explain," Zorp requested, his interest genuinely piqued. "The companion animals create an immediate emotional connection and lower defensive barriers," Xyler began. "The casual refreshment areas establish neutral territory for informal discussion. The cooking competition creates shared experiences and vulnerability. It's difficult to maintain artificial formality when you've just witnessed someone accidentally explode their cooking pot. And the memes and bubble tea, communication tools, and comfort mechanisms," Xyler replied promptly. "The memes allow complex ideas to be conveyed through cultural shorthand, often bypassing translation issues. And the bubble tea." She hesitated. "Well, I believe humans simply derive significant pleasure from sweetened beverages, which improves their negotiating disposition." Zorp found himself nodding slowly. "You're suggesting these seemingly frivolous requirements actually serve sophisticated diplomatic functions?" "Precisely," Xyler confirmed, her skin flushing a pleased purple. "I've drafted a preliminary paper on the subject, the positive psychological impact of companion animals and sweetened beverages in interstellar diplomatic environments." Zorp was about to respond when an urgent communication alert sounded throughout the station. The pleasant atmosphere dissolved immediately as delegates checked their devices. "Emergency session called," Xyler reported, her color fading to a concerned blue. "The Nebula Resource Allocation Treaty negotiations have collapsed." Zorp felt his professional concern return. The Nebula Treaty had been in delicate negotiations for nearly a decade. The resource-rich Cygnus expanse was claimed by multiple species, and the Concordat had been attempting to establish a fair distribution system. If the negotiations had broken down, it could threaten the stability of the entire sector. "We should proceed to the council chamber immediately," he said, his momentary appreciation for human methods forgotten in the face of a real diplomatic crisis. The emergency session was a disaster. Centuries of diplomatic protocol crumbled as accusations flew across the chamber. The draconian delegation threatened to withdraw from the Concordat entirely if their historical claims to the nebula weren't recognized. The Ursani coalition responded with counterthreats. Even normally placid Aquarians were expressing militant sentiments. Zorp attempted to restore order, invoking ancient rules of procedure and reminding delegates of the Concordat's proud tradition of peaceful resolution. Nothing worked. The chamber had divided into faction-based seating, with allied species clustering together and hostile glares directed across the floor. After 3 hours of increasingly hostile rhetoric, Zorp called for a recess. As delegates filed out, he noticed Ambassador Lin sitting quietly, watching the proceedings with a thoughtful expression. One of the corgis, the smallest one, called Machi, lay at her feet. "Your first taste of Concordat crisis management," Zorp commented, approaching her seat. He couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. "Perhaps now you understand why we value our protocols and traditions. Without structure, we devolve into tribal conflicts." Lin scratched Machi behind the ears before responding. "Actually, I was thinking that your traditional approach isn't working because the real issues aren't being addressed." Zorp bristled. "The Concordat has resolved countless conflicts. Through compromise and procedural maneuvering," Lin interrupted gently. "But this conflict seems to have deeper roots. Your procedures are designed to manage surface disagreements, not underlying causes. And I suppose humans have a better approach?" Zorp didn't bother hiding his skepticism. Lin smiled. "Different, at least. Would you be open to a suggestion?" 20 minutes later, Zorp found himself facing the Secretary General and the High Council in a private chamber, presenting what he knew was an outlandish proposal. "An interstellar ideation camp," repeated Secretary General Clax, all 6 of his eyes blinking in sequence. "Explain this concept." Zorp gestured to Ambassador Lin, who stepped forward confidently. "A 2-day intensive collaborative workshop," she explained, "held in a neutral, Earth-simulated environment. No hierarchical seating, no formal diplomatic protocols. Instead, structured team-building activities, creative problem-solving exercises, and opportunities for genuine connection." "This sounds highly irregular," commented High Counselor Tpren, the eldest member present. "Irregular approaches become necessary when regular ones fail," Lin replied smoothly. "The nebula conflict has festered for decades under traditional management. Perhaps it's time for a new perspective." "What specifically would this camp entail?" inquired another council member. Lin activated a holographic display showing various activities: collaborative art projects, problem-solving games, and something called karaoke battles. "The goal is to reframe the conflict," she explained. "When delegates interact as individuals rather than representatives of political entities, new possibilities emerge. By removing the formal constraints, we create space for innovation." The council chamber fell silent as the leaders considered the proposal. Zorp found himself holding his breath. Part of him hoped they would reject this unconventional approach, restoring the comfortable predictability of Concordat tradition. Another part, a part he scarcely recognized, was curious. "The traditional approaches have indeed reached an impasse," the Secretary General finally admitted, "and several delegations have expressed interest in human diplomatic methodologies." He turned his primary eyes to Zorp. "Ambassador Glorbax, you have observed the humans closely. What is your assessment?" Zorp hesitated. His career had been built on strict adherence to protocol. Speaking in favor of this unorthodox approach could jeopardize his standing. Yet he found himself thinking of the cooking competition, of the unexpected discussions that had emerged in the Cat Cafe, of Winston placing his head trustingly on the knee of the fearsome Chief Thrax. "Their methods are unorthodox," he began carefully, "often chaotic, frequently undignified. But He straightened his posture. I have observed results that cannot be easily dismissed. The humans have facilitated more informal agreements in 1 week than we typically achieve in a month. Their approach creates connections that our formal structures sometimes inhibit. The council members exchanged glances. Finally, the Secretary General nodded. Very well. We will attempt this human approach. Ambassador Lin, you will organize this ideation camp. Ambassador Glorbax will serve as liaison to ensure minimal violation of essential Concordat principles. As they left the chamber, Xyler could barely contain her excitement. This is unprecedented, a complete departure from 10,000 years of diplomatic tradition. A limited experiment, Zorp corrected her sternly, and likely doomed to failure. Ambassador Lin, walking beside them, smiled. Thank you for your support, Ambassador Glorbax. I know stepping outside traditional frameworks isn't easy. Zorp wanted to protest that he hadn't supported anything. He had merely reported his observations. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the genuine gratitude in the human's expression or the memory of the unusual sense of community during the cooking competition. The Concordat adapts when necessary, he replied diplomatically. It is how we have survived for millennia. Lin nodded. We should get planning right away. I'll need your input on which activities would be most culturally appropriate. Activities? Zorp repeated weakly. Of course. Trust Falls collaborative mural painting, rhythm circles, improv theater games. She continued listing increasingly incomprehensible human team-building exercises as they walked, Xyler eagerly taking notes beside her. Zorp's scales flushed a pale green once more. What he'd gotten himself into. The Interstellar Ideation Camp was held at the Concordat's rarely used recreational facility, a biodome designed to accommodate the leisure needs of various species. The humans had transformed it into what they called a retreat center, with different activity zones, communal dining areas, and breakout spaces for small group discussions. Participation was technically voluntary, but with the High Council's endorsement, most key delegations felt obligated to attend. Still, the atmosphere was tense as delegates arrived, clearly uncomfortable with the casual setting and unclear expectations. Welcome, everyone. Ambassador Lin addressed the assembled representatives. She had abandoned her formal diplomatic attire for what she called business casual, a concept that bewildered many delegates who saw attire as a clear indicator of rank and function. For the next 2 days, we're going to explore the nebula conflict from new angles. But first, we need to get to know each other as people, not just political entities. The first activity involved forming mixed-species groups and creating collaborative art pieces representing shared galactic dreams. Zorp, assigned to a group with 2 draconians, an Aquarian, and a human aide named Thomas, stared at the art supplies in dismay. I fail to see how creating primitive visual displays will resolve complex territorial disputes, he muttered to Xyler, who was floating between groups as an observer. Approach it as an anthropological experiment, she suggested brightly. The process is more important than the outcome. Reluctantly, Zorp selected a brush-like implement and joined his group's efforts. To his surprise, as they worked together on their abstract creation, conversation flowed more naturally than it had in formal sessions. The Draconian representative, usually stoic Commander Krosvik, revealed an unexpected aesthetic sensibility and a fondness for symmetrical patterns. The Aquarian shared stories of the bioluminescent art forms in their oceanic homeworld. By mid-afternoon, Zorp found himself participating in a problem-solving challenge that required his team to construct a bridge using only the materials provided. The activity had nothing overtly to do with the nebula conflict, yet somehow, as they worked together, conversations about resource allocation and collaborative approaches emerged organically. That evening featured an activity called Open Mic Night, where delegates were encouraged to share stories, songs, or performances from their cultures. Zorp had firmly declined to participate, but he found himself moved by the unexpected beauty of an Ursani morning chant and fascinated by human performance art called stand-up comedy, which seemed to consist primarily of pointed observations about interspecies misunderstandings. The second day focused more directly on the nebula conflict, but through structured activities rather than formal negotiations. Delegates participated in role reversal exercises, defending positions opposite to their own. They created visual maps of resource needs versus wants. They engaged in something called speed solutioning, rapidly generating and sharing ideas without immediate criticism. Zorp observed it all with growing astonishment. Delegates who had been hostile in formal sessions were now engaged in productive dialogue. The rigid hierarchies that typically governed interactions had temporarily dissolved. Even more surprisingly, potential solutions were emerging, ideas that had never been considered in the formal proceedings. During an afternoon breakthrough session, a junior draconian scientist and an Aquarian cultural attaché discovered a shared interest in nebula bioluminescence patterns. Their casual conversation led to an innovative proposal. Certain regions of the nebula could be designated as scientific research zones, co-managed by multiple species with a focus on studying the unique life forms that had evolved there. This spark of an idea was quickly expanded upon. Other delegates suggested additional collaborative approaches to different regions of the nebula, based on each species' particular interests and needs rather than simple territorial division. By the final session, a framework had emerged that looked nothing like the original proposals, yet somehow addressed the core concerns of all involved parties. Resources would be shared according to specialization rather than territory. Collaborative research would be prioritized. A rotating governing council would ensure all voices remained heard. As the camp concluded and delegates prepared to return to the station, Zorp found Ambassador Lin observing the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. A remarkable outcome, he acknowledged, surprising himself with the admission. Though entirely unorthodox in methodology, Lin smiled. Sometimes the direct path isn't the most effective one. Humans learned that the hard way through our own history. Your approach creates significant disorder, Zorp noted, yet somehow produces results. Controlled chaos, Lin suggested. Like the evolutionary process itself. Seemingly random variations that eventually create new patterns and possibilities. Zorp considered this. The Concordat values stability above all. Change occurs slowly, deliberately. A valid approach, Lin agreed. But occasionally, a catalyst accelerates necessary evolution. She gestured to where delegates were exchanging contact information and continuing discussions. The Concordat isn't changing its fundamental nature. It's expanding its methodological toolkit. Before Zorp could respond, Winston the Corgi trotted up and placed a paw on his leg. After a moment's hesitation, Zorp bent down and gently stroked the creature's head. I believe, he said carefully, that your Winston has been conducting his own form of diplomacy throughout this conference. Lin laughed. Absolutely. Sometimes the simplest connections are the most powerful. That's something we try not to forget, despite our technological advancement. As they returned to the main station, Zorp found himself reflecting on the past week's events. The High Council would be expecting his final assessment of Earth's readiness to join the Concordat. Despite his initial skepticism, he could not deny the evidence before him. The humans had managed to resolve a conflict that had defeated conventional approaches for years. Their methods were chaotic, their customs bewildering, but their results spoke for themselves. The formal closing ceremony of the Peace and Integration Summit followed Concordat tradition. Mostly, Secretary-General of Clax presided from the Grand Central Podium, with delegates seated according to their world's admission date to the Alliance. The chamber was decorated with the formal symbols of all member species. But there were new elements as well. In the corner, the Cat Cafe remained operational, now with a small plaque designating it as the Interspecies Emotional Interaction Zone. Several delegates had their Concordat formal robes customized with subtle Earth-inspired elements. And when refreshments were served, bubble tea was offered alongside traditional options. By unanimous decision of the High Council, the Secretary-General announced, his ceremonial voice echoing through the chamber, Earth is hereby admitted to the Galactic Concordat as a full member world, with all associated rights and responsibilities. Ambassador Lin stepped forward to accept the formal certificate of membership. The human delegation applauded, another custom that had somehow spread to several other species during the conference. In recognition of Earth's unique contributions to our diplomatic methodologies, the Secretary General continued, the Council has approved several special amendments to our procedural codes. Zorp, seated in his position of honor, felt a mixture of resignation and amusement as the Secretary General enumerated the changes. Official provisions for therapy animal diplomatic credentials, guidelines for the appropriate use of humorous imagery in formal communications, and an annual budget allocation for bubble tea. When the ceremony concluded, Zorp found himself approaching Ambassador Lin at the reception. "Your world has certainly made an impression on the Concordat," he observed. Lin smiled. "Change can be uncomfortable, but often worthwhile. I hope we haven't disrupted too many of your traditions." "Some disruption is occasionally necessary," Zorp admitted. He hesitated, then added, "The High Council was particularly impressed with the resolution of the Nebula conflict. Your methods, while unorthodox, proved effective." "Different approaches for different situations," Lin suggested. "We have much to learn from the Concordat's stability and wisdom. Perhaps together, we can create something greater than either tradition alone." She reached into her pocket and removed a small object, a holographic tag bearing the image of Winston the Corgi. "A small token of appreciation for your patience with our unusual ways." Zorp accepted the gift, surprised by the gesture. Thank you, Ambassador. It has been an educational experience." As the human delegation prepared for departure the next day, Zorp found himself actually saying farewell to each of the corgis individually. Winston, in particular, seemed reluctant to leave, placing his paws on Zorp's knees and looking up with what the ambassador now recognized as affection. "He's saying he'll miss you," explained the human handler. "Corgis form strong attachments." "Indeed," Zorp replied formally, giving Winston a final pat. "His diplomatic skills are considerable." 6 months later, Zorp stood in the newly expanded interspecies emotional interaction zone at Alpha Central Station. What had begun as a temporary cat cafe had evolved into a permanent fixture, a large, comfortable space where delegates could interact informally with companion animals from various worlds. The Earth felines have been joined by Centaurian flutterbirds, Proximate empathy lizards, and even a few Denebian mood-sensing fungi. Nearby, a group of junior diplomats was participating in what had become a regular meme creation workshop, learning to convey complex diplomatic concepts through culturally resonant imagery. "The intergalactic bubble tea stand is reporting record sales," Xyler announced, approaching with a data pad. "And the first official Concordat cooking competition has 17 species registered already." Zorp accepted the report with a nod. "And the Nebula Collaborative Research Initiative?" "Exceeding all expectations," Xyler reported happily. 3 new species of energy-converting microorganisms discovered already. The Joint Draconian Aquarian Research Team is being nominated for the Galactic Science Merit Award. Zorp looked out the observation window. Below, in one of the station's open areas, he could see several diplomats from traditionally hostile species throwing a ball for a small contingent of corgis that now resided permanently on the station. Their laughter echoed faintly through the reinforced glass. Xyler followed his gaze. The quarterly satisfaction metrics show a 37% increase in delegate well-being and a 42% improvement in resolution rates for minor disputes. "And what of our traditions? Our protocols?" Zorp asked, more curious than concerned. "Evolving," Xyler replied simply. "The core principles remain: peace, cooperation, mutual respect. The methods adapt." She handed him a cup of bubble tea, taro flavor, which had become his preferred variety, though he would rarely admit it publicly. The Galactic Concordat was changing. It was louder, sweeter, and perhaps significantly more vital than it had been for centuries. Zorp sipped his tea, feeling the chewy tapioca pearls rise through the straw, and allowed himself something he had once considered highly inappropriate in a diplomatic setting: a small, genuine smile.